things that I know it's on all of your minds. The last time I did a live stream, which was yesterday, we chatted about voter ID, and that's going to be the focus for today. So I hope you are all buckled in. I was able to get some research, not as extensive as I'd like, but the focus today will be on voter ID. And I'm also going to chat about the comment section because it seems to me that I might have struck a nerve with conservatives about Elon Musk. There seems to be this like very much die-hard view when it comes to Elon Musk. And folks, let me just be clear. I think Elon Musk is doing a lot of great things for humanity writ large, but that does not mean that he is immune from criticism. So those are going to be the topics for today. I hope you all are enjoying it. By the way, folks, definitely subscribe to me on Instagram if you haven't, at Open Minds Pod, on TikTok if you haven't, at Christopher Balkaran, Balkaran. Folks, I'm trying to hit 1,000 followers on TikTok so I can do this behind my computer and not behind my phone. So thank you so much. If you haven't already, I will strongly encourage you to subscribe. And folks, I can't not talk about my podcast, Open Minds with Christopher Balkaran. Anywhere you stream music, my mission here is specifically on making sure we're engaging in open and honest conversation. I was reading something by Adam Grant, and he said, have confident humility. And that's what I'm going to do here, folks. Have confident humility. There's going to be many times I get things 100% wrong, and I'm going to do so stumbling through. But in doing so, I know it's going to lead us to a better way, a better form of communicating, better policies that are being put in place, and a more nuanced perspective, not only of myself and what I think, but also perhaps of yours as well. So you can continue to refine your own points as well. But folks, before I begin and talk about Elon Musk in the comment section and voter ID and all that, folks, it's not lost on me that today is October 7th. Now, I know a lot of you have probably been bombarded with media on both sides. Maybe you have friends and family who are connected to pro-Palestinian movements or pro-Israeli movements. I was at an event today, and this person made a very good point when they were saying, like, at the end of the day, you know, we can't talk about this conflict without talking about the innocent lives that are being lost on all sides. You know, people going about their daily lives being killed. And I don't know what the solution is, folks. If I did, I would definitely communicate that to all of you. But I know one thing, and that is this is a very complicated issue, and there is no one side. And I think we have to remind ourselves when we're talking about Israel, when we're talking about Palestine, that there's a humanity level involved in all of this. There's human lives at stake, and there's human lives being lost. And I don't want that to take away. I mean, that should not be ever not, kind of included. But I notice when we do talk about this issue, we often lose that humanity piece. We treat these as like, I don't know, we treat it very inhumane sometimes. So as long as we're talking about humanity on all sides, recognizing anti-Semitism is huge in Canada. You know, Canada, when you look at our hate crimes, I believe anti-Semitism is like miles ahead of everything else. I could be wrong, but I do remember seeing anti-Semitism as the number one hate crime in Canada. That has been sustained since the Second World War, the end of the Second World War. So, let's not negate that, but at the same time, there is a lot of um, issues associated with the pro-Palestine movement as well. And, there's something to be said about that too. So I would love for all of you to take some time and just reflect on the humanity of it all. I think all of us probably agree that the human element needs to always be at the forefront. Just looking at the comments here on TikTok, someone asked me a question and it was just lost. Ralph says, what party do you think would ever form a coalition with the Conservatives? Interesting question there, Ralph. I don't know. I really don't know. I think that, there's coalitions all the time, especially in Canadian politics, when it comes to bringing governments down. Stephen Harper did that with the Bloc um, years and years ago, and the NDP as well. So I don't think that there are coalitions formally that parties would agree to with the Conservatives. But there are parties that would agree with the Conservatives when bringing down the government to suit a very specific need. Hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining. We're gonna chat about a few things today. And I'm going to jump right in and see some comments from Jay Ramesh. Jay Ramesh is a longtime subscriber or a recent subscriber, but checking in on all my stuff. Jay Ramesh on Instagram says, be more specific on what comments were said by conservatives. I will, Jay Ramesh, later in the show, and I've got some comments lined up because I'd love for what people would love to hear about that. And Jay Ramesh says, with all due respect, I apologize if I'm mistaken, but I went to your website and it looks like you haven't updated your podcast in over a month. Jay Ramesh, you are on it. I've never had someone do such a deep dive on all my content, but you are right. And new content is coming your way. I'm only one man, Jay Ramesh. I don't have a team like some of the bigger guys, but trust me when I say there's more content coming your way. I'm doing what I can, but thanks for that. Thanks for those comments, folks. And just remember, folks, definitely hit that subscribe button on TikTok. Definitely hit that subscribe button on Instagram, YouTube. There's some comments I'm going to get to. Man, the comment section is spicy. Okay, folks, let's dive right into it. Folks, in my last live stream, I asked the question about why voter ID is so important. Like, why is this such a big deal in the United States? And the reason I ask that is because in Canada, man, every election, we need voter ID for federal, provincial, and municipal elections. So as a Canadian, I just don't understand why there are states like California that don't require voter ID. I just don't understand that. And I'm not trying to be like conservative, Republican, etc., not thinking about the underrepresented groups. But my criticism is there are underrepresented groups in Canada. And I've never heard the argument in Canada that voter ID is a barrier to them participating in our elections. And yet it seems to be a big deal in the United States. And so I wanted to do like a comparative look at other G7 countries to see, am I going crazy? Is Canada really the only country that requires voter ID? And it turns out we're not. Across the G7, pretty much all G7 countries except for the United States requires the voter ID. In the UK, it requires voters to show photo ID at polling stations in England, Scotland, and Wales for general elections. Passports, driver's licenses, government issued ID. Same with local elections. And then the same is true for Northern Ireland. France, voters must show photo ID at the polling station. Same with municipal elections. Same in Germany, both at the federal and state and local elections. In Italy, the same thing. In Japan, Japan is interesting. It doesn't always require voter ID, but it instead relies more on pre-registration. Um, and what's interesting is that there are countries inside the European, outside the G7 that, may or may not require voter ID. So very interesting to see across the G7, there seems to be almost unanimity, except for the case of Japan, for voter ID when it comes to voting. So what I decided to do from there is say, okay, I'm not going crazy. Voter ID is a common reality of the G7. So then what's the debate in the US? Why is it that the US really does hammer home voter ID? And so what I did is I went to go through some research, and I really wanted to know what are the major arguments against voter ID? And this is what I found. I read maybe 4 or 5 different academic articles. The first argument, the almost ubiquitous argument across many articles, is the quote disenfranchisement of vulnerable groups. So critics argue that voter ID laws disproportionately affect minority, low income, elderly, and disabled voters, many of whom may not possess the required forms of identification. For instance, seniors who don't have birth certificates, underrepresented groups who may not have access to government services. These can create significant hurdles for those without easy access to the necessary documentation, birth certificates, government IDs. Um, so that's the main argument that a lot of these articles have. I'm going to pause there. I see a comment. Um, Xenu says, could it also be another hurdle to vote even for regular people? Exactly. Like, that was my number one thing. It's like, what differentiates those who lack birth certificates from, let's say, low-income families, the elderly, etcetera, than from middle-class families? I never understood that. So that was the number one argument against voter ID laws. Um, Katya, thank you for that gift. I appreciate that, and thank you for coming back. Um, the other argument that the researchers mention is that a common thing that a common criticism that a lot of people say is that there's widespread voter ID fraud because there's no voter ID requirements. But opponents say that there's actually little evidence of widespread in-person voter fraud, which voter ID is designed to prevent. Now, I tried to get into more detail about this, but I couldn't. So to me, I feel like there would need to be robust statistical data to show that in-person voter fraud is negligible in comparison to those jurisdictions where voter ID is mandatory. So voter advocacy groups mention that voter ID laws address problems that are largely a quote splinter rather than a systemic issue. So again, I would love to know what you think about that. If you think that that's true, let me know in the comments below. Again, the lack of evidence for widespread fraud. Now, again, I don't necessarily agree with that, but let me know what you think. The third argument against voter ID is the effect on voter participation. So, some people say that if you mandate voter ID, it creates this chilling effect. It discourages potential voters from participating due to the fear of being turned away at the polls or being unfamiliar with voter ID requirements. Now, I'm gonna pause there because I don't believe that to be true either. Because here in Canada, again, voter ID, as long as I've been voting, and I'm not no spring chicken, even though I might look like that. Um, it's always been like voter turnout has always been low. So I just wonder if if the voter ID laws are in fact the reason why there's low voter turnout, or is it that people just don't vote? Like, that's a reality. People just don't vote for whatever reason. And so I'm curious as to why authors would say there's this chilling effect discouraging potential voters from participating. I don't know if I truly believe that, because to me it doesn't seem that to be the case. I think people just don't vote. Um, Lynn says exactly that. People just don't vote. Yeah, like, I don't think that voter ID laws make a difference on that, but maybe I'm wrong. Um, Critics argue that voters, especially those who lack the required ID, may be deterred from even attempting to vote if they believe they will face difficulties or rejection at the polls. Like, I find this to be so odd because it seems like the researchers are grasping at straws to justify not having voter ID. And I just don't understand these arguments. Okay, the final one is the historical and legal concerns. So a lot of the researchers talk about so Lynn says on TikTok, you have to show your ID at the poll. So why is this an issue? So Lynn, the US is, I believe, the only G7 country where voter ID is not required in every state to vote. California just passed a law. I'm trying to find it, where voter ID is not a requirement to vote, which is pretty wild when you think about it. Um, So I'm gonna continue on just on this last point here. Um, I like seeing what the comments say. Okay, the last is a historical and legal concern. So the researchers said this is intertwined with the broader history of voting rights in the U.S., particularly issues around the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Section 5 states this required federal oversight of changes to voter laws in certain jurisdictions, which was a major tool for protecting minority voting rights. Many see the push for stricter voter ID laws as a step backwards from the Voting Rights Act. Lawsuits often challenge voter ID on the grounds that they violate protections against discriminatory practices, arguing that they are unfairly burdening specific groups in a way that undermines the progress made by the VRA. Um, I am going to look into that some more because I think that's a little bit a, a little bit confusing. So I just want to just expand on that a little bit more, and I just want to reiterate that again, voter ID is a major concern in the U.S. Uh, Sorry, guys. I just want to make sure that I am doing my research properly. Okay, so I just want to make sure that we all understand these are the reasons that are being put forward. I don't personally think that these reasons are substantial enough. Like they seem lacking substance, but maybe I'm alone on that. Just going to read some of the comments here on TikTok. Um, Jay Ramesh says, I could be wrong, but even in states without voter ID, you still need voter ID. I believe that's a good question, Jay Ramesh. I don't know if that's fully true, but I think you're right. I think you need to be registered. Okay, so you need to be a citizen of the US to vote, period. And we debunked that last night. There are people in the comments saying you don't need to be a citizen to vote in the US. Yes, you do. That's according to the United States website, the government of the United States website. You do need to be a citizen to vote. Um, I think you still need, and okay, I think this is the issue, Jay Ramesh. The issue is that you need to register to vote, and in order to register to vote, you need to have some form of ID. But once you're registered, I don't think you need to show that ID when you vote. Um, I'm sure someone in the comments will call me out on that. Um, Katya Busy Bee says, "What's going on here today? Reviewing research meant to help to commit fraud." I like that. Um, yes, I think you need ID to register to vote. That's correct. You do need ID to register to vote. So, folks, the reason why this is such a big issue is because there are people who are saying that voter ID, there's a lot of voter fraud, but we have to be very specific in what we're saying when it comes to voter fraud. Um, Usman, I see you've just joined. I know you messaged me, Usman, about jumping on the live stream. So let me know if you still want to do that. I think you can probably send an invite. I just went over some research about the arguments the arguments against mandating voter ID. I'm not totally convinced, to be completely honest. And again, looking in a comparative lens, Usman, I actually went over all the G7 nations, and except for Japan, every other G7 nation requires voter ID. And in Japan's case, they don't always require voter ID at polling stations, but they do require a voter registration card instead. So the arguments that I went over, again at a very high level, I just had them all out here. Disenfranchisement of vulnerable groups, alleged lack of evidence of widespread voter fraud, chilling effects on voter participation, and the historical and legal concerns of the Voting Rights Act, which I'm a bit, again, I need to do a little bit more on that to unpack it. But folks, I think what I'm taking from all of this is a couple things that I think both sides need to really refine in our discussions on this. For the left and those arguing against voter ID, I think your perspectives need to be refined with the fact that the majority of developed nations around the world require voter ID, and underrepresented groups in those communities, I don't know, it's not fully well known whether or not those groups feel the discrimination that those in the US are saying. And so that's one. So for those on the left, I think it's very important that if you're going to say underrepresented groups are discriminated against, it doesn't hold enough weight in a comparative lens when we're thinking of like the rest of the world. Because it's like there are poor people, underrepresented groups in other G7 nations. They're not making any arguments, to my knowledge, about being suppressed in their voting as a result of showing their ID at the votes at the elections. So for the left, I would say that argument kind of falters, but I need to do more research myself. But for the right, and this is where my conservative friends, I'm I would consider myself conservative. I'm gonna challenge all of us right now and say often we hear um that this leads to widespread voter fraud. If you don't require voter ID, there's going to be widespread voter fraud. Now, one thing the researchers said, because I researched 5 or 6 articles, right? And so it's not just one person, but one thing they said is there's not enough evidence to show widespread voter fraud. So it's not like all these people without voter ID are showing up at polling stations and swaying the election. And I think that's something that conservatives have long argued. Now, I don't know enough to say for sure that's not happening, but what I will say is that's something that the right and us conservatives need to refine in our perspective. Because you have to remember to prove widespread voter fraud from those without voter ID is actually really hard to prove. You know what I mean? Like you'd have to prove that in a very factual way. And I think this is where a lot of like Democrats, liberals were very skeptical about Donald Trump when he was saying, "Hey, they stole the election, they stole the election, they stole the election." It's like there's so much proof, and I'm not disputing that. I do think that there is voter irregularities that need to be investigated. I think they were, but there's so much overwhelming evidence that the Trump administration would have need to show to prove that claim. And again, I'm not saying that it didn't happen, but the proof, the onus is on the individual making the claim. So if you're going to say that, you have to prove that. And it's really hard. It's almost impossible to prove widespread voter fraud of those who don't have voter identification. So that's what I would say for the right, to refine our perspective on this widespread voter fraud, to say it exists, the possibility of widespread voter fraud exists, and perhaps that's amplified without voter ID, but we would need to do more research to find that out. But I would love to know what you all are saying, and I'll think about that. But I think both sides need to refine their perspectives on this. Usman says implementation is important. I mentioned Texas, for example, Usman. Good point. I would just need to, again, know more specifically about the Texas example. I think you mentioned that the other night. My apologies. These chats aren't saved on TikTok. Lynn says you don't want other people from other countries voting in your country's elections and having a say. And Lynn, I think that is something that that we should explore some more, because I don't know that that's happening to the extent in which it is. And I've been criticized a lot on Insta, in some people's minds, rightfully or wrongfully so, when it comes to criticizing Elon Musk, which I'll get to in a moment. But I think that for the right, we're very much like, we're very susceptible to the doom and gloom, very similar to what I hear on the left. So on the left, we see, Kamala Harris says, this is our last election. Trump, we have to get rid of Trump. He's terrible, da da da. But on the right, we see the same kind of doom and gloom, but in different kind of words and lexicon. And I think this is a prime example where we sometimes think that without voter ID, all these illegal immigrants are coming in here and they're swaying the election. And in order for us on the right to prove that would be so onerous. And I don't know if there's any statistics done on the voter participation of illegal immigrants. I don't know the stats on that, but my assumption is that would be low because I would argue perhaps, civic engagement, um, it doesn't happen when you have immediate concerns, um, like making sure your family's taken care of, et cetera, et cetera. So all that to say, it's something to be said about us proving that. I think it's very important. Um, Let me just look at the comments here, folks. I just want to make sure that I am responding to everyone. Jay Ramesh says, I would disagree that the idea that this is a bit that big of an issue in the US. Jay Ramesh, I do think it's a big issue because a lot of people have asked me, well, not like that matters, but like a lot of people have asked me about it, but also a lot of people have mentioned that, and it is something that people are talking about on a regular basis. So something may not be as big an issue, but it certainly is an issue for many Americans. Um, Zenu says, I think things just have been this way for a while and government is too lazy to fix it, not rigged. That's a good point, eh? That's actually a really good point, Zenu. This could be an issue for a while and government's just too damn lazy to fix it. And as a result, it's not rigged, it's just not fixed. And as a result of that, it leads to voter like ID irregularity, etc. Jay Ramesh says, what is your view on permanent residents voting in local elections in the US? That's a good question, Jay Ramesh. I don't know enough to provide like an informed perspective. I guess as a layman, I will say layman. I don't know. Like I see the merit in anyone voting in like a local election. If you're a permanent resident, you're vested in some way in your community. Um, but I also take the point that, when you're a citizen of a country, there are rights and freedoms and privileges that are extended to you as a result of being a citizen. And that should not be lost as well. Like there should be value add for your citizenship. And so I take the point that permanent residents should be able to vote if they aren't allowed. I understand that. But I also understand that being a citizen, gives you that right as well and you're allowed to do so too. So I don't know enough really to make an informed position point. Um Okay, so Usman, sorry Usman, I'm missing your comments here. Um, so Usman said, using the Texas as an example, gun licenses were allowed, I guess, as voter ID, but student IDs were allowed as a method to select Republicans. Yeah, student IDs were not allowed. There we go. So Usman says in Texas, gun licenses were allowed, but student IDs were not allowed as a method to select Republicans. I think that's Usman's point. Um, and Nemnock, hey Nemnock, glad you're back. Um, Nemnock says, yep, exactly this. Student IDs were not allowed. It was specific to target Republican voters, which makes I see that point. So I see that point. That seems odd why they would allow like gun licenses to be used as voter ID and not student ID. That makes that I understand. Um, but the question is, um, I just had a question now I forgot. It could also be that, and again, I'm not an expert on the implementation in Texas, but I'm assuming that similar to Canada, if you want photo identification, there's a process involved. And maybe, just maybe, the process involved in getting student identification is much more lax than getting a gun license or getting a driver's license or getting a passport. Like, I'm assuming any and all of those things require the individual to put forward way more information than a student ID. I could be wrong, and I'm not trying to side with anyone, but perhaps that's the rationale versus, oh, you have a gun license, we're targeting Republican voters. I'm going to be honest with you guys, it's Texas. I've been to Texas multiple times. you don't need to convince anyone to vote Republican in Texas. Like it's not rigged for Republicans. You could just show up and there'll be Republicans there. No, no question. Um, let's see what folks are saying. Zeno says, I'm Canadian, so I can sniff out a case of slow and efficient bureaucracy. Zeno, we should chat. Jay Ramesh says, I agree with Usman that this is a problem, but the solution should be expanded access to student IDs. Katya Busy Bee says, perhaps there was fraud. Maybe even some people eat cats and dogs in Ohio, but the way he said it. I love that, Katya. I love the brevity you're providing on this live stream. All right. Yes. Jay Ramesh makes a good point. There's also an issue with international students as far as voter ID. So also things that we have to consider, right? So we can't look at research. We can't look at things, in a one-dimensional approach. We have to look at it as like a very comprehensive way as well. Okay, folks, those are my thoughts on voter ID in the US. Again, I don't think that we're doing as great a justice to it. I'm still perplexed by the arguments against voter ID. I hear what a lot of you are saying and what the researchers are saying, but it still perplexes me, again, on a comparative basis, other countries around the world. And what's also odd is that these countries also have underrepresented groups, and they are not feeling disenfranchised by showing their voter ID. Now, that is a statement I'm making, but it's because there's no research to show that these underrepresented groups in Canada, in France, in the UK, in Germany, in Italy, etc., feel disenfranchised because they have to show ID to vote. And I think that's the critical question that I keep coming back to when it comes to voter ID. Like, if this is as ubiquitous in the US as in other countries, this would show up in other countries. But it's not. And so that tells me that perhaps this voter ID thing is more politically motivated in the US than it is actually based on fact and reality. But maybe I'm alone on that, folks. I don't know. But let me know what you think. Okay, folks, the most exciting part of today is the comment section. So, folks, if if you follow me on Instagram at Open Minds Pod, you'll know that I posted something about Elon Musk. And my whole point there, and I talked about this last night on the live stream, was basically about the fact that I find it weird that Elon Musk is this proponent of free speech, this proponent of freedom, and he's wearing a MAGA hat and telling people to register to vote at a Trump rally. Like, I just find that weird. That's just me. Maybe I'm alone on that. But I just think that if you're going to encourage people to vote, you should not be, campaigning for Kamala Harris. You should not be campaigning for Donald Trump. You should do your own individual campaign and say, I don't care if you're left or right, get out and register to vote. That's what I would say if I truly believe in people voting. If I truly believe in freedom, and here's the other thing, and this is perhaps what irks a lot of conservatives, which came up in the comments. If I truly believe in freedom, I would not care if people voted or not. If I truly, truly believe in freedom, I would not care. Like, if I am a champion of freedom and your right to choose to vote or not, I would not care. That would not be something that would enter my mind frame, because at the end of the day, as long as um, amendment, that's not amendment, as long as these sections of the Constitution apply to you, that's your choice. If you don't want to vote, that's your choice. If you do want to vote, that's your choice. That's why I'm so skeptical about Elon Musk saying he's a champion for freedom, because if you truly believe in it, you would not care if people vote or not. But anyhow, that didn't seem to sit well with a lot of conservatives in the comments. Many were very much against it. And I think the reality is us conservatives, and I would consider myself a conservative as well, We are very susceptible to the God analogy. We're very susceptible to simplistic narratives, and we're also very sensitive because we have all seen like liberal media. We've all seen how things have been rigged against conservatives in mainstream media, the way in which they cover things, etc. It's just so one sided. And so now we have someone like, Elon Musk, who's controlling Twitter, who can, re-inject more balance in our discourse with a different perspective. But in doing so, we put a lot of faith in the Elon Musks of the world, in the Jordan Petersons of the world, in a lot of people who are as susceptible to being salespeople to us, pulling the wool over our eyes, telling us one thing, selling us on something. We're just as susceptible as that as the left is to Obama, Hillary Clinton, Kamala Harris, Oprah, The View, the whole panel of The View. Um, we're just as susceptible. It's just there's now someone on our side, quote unquote. But when a conservative criticizes other conservatives, it gets it gets so wild. And that's what happened in the comments. Now, I'm not going to read everything because it was pretty much a shit show for the most part. I wouldn't say shit show. There were very thoughtful comments there, but I wanted to read some for you just to help my conservative friends see what it is that I'm seeing in your comments. So a lot of people said this is Elon Musk's right to free speech. And I don't disagree with that. That is Elon Musk's right to free speech. It's just he's telling you to register to vote at a Trump rally wearing a MAGA hat. I mean, that's not, again, if you're truly in favor of freedom, you wouldn't care if people voted or not. But one thing I found was that a lot of conservatives were not looking anymore at what I was saying. They were conflating that with all of like the liberal, stuff that's happening. So this one person said, the Democrats have openly said free speech needs to be controlled. Musk understands that once you put in the same laws as the EU to ban certain types of speech, it's over. You can go to jail in the UK for things you say on Facebook. It's only weird if you don't understand what's at stake. So this is the doom and gloom thing that Republicans and conservatives really do latch onto. Musk did it at a Trump rally because the only people that understand this sense of urgency were there. One side will give you the freedom to say what you like, even if it's unpleasant. The other wants to criminalize what you can say, even if it's true. Do you think he can say vote because free speech is on the line at a Kamala rally? I don't disagree with that. I actually see that point. But you have to remember too that and I've said this before, Republicans and conservatives are all for free speech, but let's just be very clear. When national security is on the line, free speech is not something that conservatives champion during those times. And all of us, most of us probably here on the live streams went through 9/11. We remember clearly that after 9/11, a lot of civil rights and liberties were curtailed in the days, weeks, and months right after 9/11. And that continued for years. I mean, the security apparatus at our airports, in my opinion, in many ways, is a violation of our civil rights. When you think of body scans that look at your naked body, that I remember people being like, "What the hell's going on?" I remember an entire monitoring apparatus that was tossed around. They could monitor your conversations, etc. When you enter an airport. I remember those being tossed around, and people were really debating that. When you like monitoring your flight, your travel patterns, all the whole security apparatus post 9/11 was a direct result of, I would argue, more conservative Republican policymakers who were very much concerned about national security. So don't get it twisted. Freedom in the truest, realest form changes with the changing tides of politics as well. And what happens in our society changes our politics as well. And so again, while I do believe conservatives are better, when it comes to what's happening on our university campuses than the liberals. Um, if there is a national security threat, Republicans and conservatives are very quick to curtail our freedoms just as quick. And if you don't believe me, again, if you lived through 9/11 and you saw the security apparatus after, you all know what I'm talking about. Um, Other people were kind of disparaging in the comments. I don't want to go too much into that, but I want to dispel that. Um, there's somebody said, oh yeah, they're just like going in on me. But I want to read another comment because I thought this one was also pretty good. Um, So this is another thing where, again, I think conservatives, and I'm not saying all conservatives, but some conservatives really do. They get really upset when you criticize Trump or Musk or anyone. So this person on Instagram says, "I did not see that at all. Wearing a hat doesn't mean anything to me." I think wearing a hat means something to a lot of us, including conservatives. But to some people, it could be a deterrent. And so that means that Elon wearing the MAGA hat was a big gamble, but he did it anyway. It's just an accessory. And he wanted to voice the idea that people need to vote. It's their duty, especially this year, because if Democrats get their way and nix voter ID in every state, then there will never, ever be a fair election again. So again, the doom and gloom idea that we're talking about here. Again, downplaying wearing the MAGA hat, and I think that that's something we need to talk about more because wearing the MAGA hat, wearing the keffiyeh, wearing these are symbols and these are political symbols, and we should all be okay with them. To be completely honest, if you truly believe in freedom, we should be okay with wearing them and what they represent. We shouldn't be against it and we shouldn't downplay it. They are political symbols. They represent a political ideology, whether we like to believe that or not. It's like wearing a Che Guevara shirt, you wear a Che Guevara shirt to like anything. People generally know what you're in favor of, and you're generally in favor of like socialism or the working class or whatever. So we can't downplay that. But here's where I think a lot of conservatives who were coming at me actually got this wrong, where they said, he's just telling people to vote. And if they don't vote, Democrats will get their way and nix voter ID in every state, and there will never be a fair election again. Yeah, that's like, if that isn't political bias, I don't know what is. I mean, that's basically like Kamala Harris telling her voters, go out and vote because Trump is going to drive this country into the ground. It's not freedom. It's a political message, and I just don't understand why conservatives are so fearful of Elon Musk being labeled a conservative with a conservative message. He's not just telling people to vote. He's telling people to vote conservative. And I don't see what the problem with that is, but just don't be a champion of freedom. That's my point, because freedom doesn't care about conservative or liberal. Um, Nemnock says MSM, mainstream media is against conservatives, is hilarious. Nemnock, I think most people would agree with that, but let me know what you think. Conservatives aren't for free speech. Musk was sued because people exercised free speech. Interesting. Jay Ramesh says conservatives aren't a monolith. There are different factions of conservatives within the U.S. Jay Ramesh, of course there are, but that's interesting that you say that, because I've said liberals and left wing and left leaning countless times on this live stream, and never once have you or others mentioned, hey, by the way, left wing liberals, etc., are not a monolith. They're different factions. So again, like, I listen, Jay Ramesh, I'm a conservative, like economically conservative, economically liberal, socially conservative. I understand what you're saying, but this is the sensitivity that many conservatives have. We are so sensitive to some things when it comes to politics, and I don't know why. Like, if we're so in favor of freedom, why are we so sensitive when it comes to our own critiquing ourselves? I'll never understand it. Um, uh, Nemnock says, but their politicians are very much as I described. I think that's to an earlier comment I made. I went on for a bit, Nemnock. My apologies. Um, does a champion of free speech have to be politically neutral? That's a good question, Zenu. Um, I don't think so, but I actually agree with Nemnock here, which is a rarity, Nemnock, you and I agreeing. Um, no, but they actually do have to believe in free speech. Yes, 100%. Free When you really think of free speech, it is a scary concept, to be honest. Like it's truly a very scary concept because in a truly free society, and again, this is not anything new, but like the masters of Greek thought, like Plato and Socrates, would question who's it in for? Is it being guardrailed by humans? That isn't free speech because if the guardrails are up by humans, then it's laced with their bias. It's laced with their kind of, understanding of the world. And, that's not good either. So if we truly believe in free speech, it can't be governed by humans. Like, I think that's what Socrates would say. He said, I'm skeptical of anyone that is truly like, pursuing unbiased stuff because you're a human being. Jay Ramesh says, I'm sorry, thanks for holding me accountable to my own bias. Thanks, Jay Ramesh, for being um so open about that. Nemnock says that's where the tolerance paradox kicks in. And we've talked about this, Nemnock, as well, about the paradox of tolerance or the paradox of intolerance. It's like, what is tolerant behavior versus what is intolerant? And I think and who's defining that? Here in Canada, I think there's two books that are banned. Mein Kampf and Lolita. I think there's a third. Mein Kampf, Hitler's autobiography. Lolita, I believe, is a book on, I believe it was like sexual assault of a minor, I think was like the main storyline. Those books are banned. There's other books in Canada that are not banned that I've read that I'm like, what the hell? How is this allowed on our bookshelves? If anyone's read The Rape of Nanking, I just cannot understand. I mean, it's a very graphic book, and that is allowed on our bookshelves here in Canada. And I think it's a very important story. Like, don't get me wrong, it's a very important story, but I would not recommend people read that book. As important as that issue is, that book goes into graphic detail about what happened in Nanking. And there's no warning in that book about, anyone of any age could go into the library and take that book out and they would be traumatized about what they read. But anyways, yeah, like who determines what is tolerable and what is not? So that was those are some of the kind of like the feedback, and I'm so glad that I posted that stuff about Elon because in a way I kind of exposed to many conservatives their own blind spots that they are being sold something, and I know they think that it's so much better than the liberals and better than the Democrats, and I get that. I understand that completely. But they, including myself, we're just as susceptible to those salespeople. Donald Trump is a salesperson, you know. Elon Musk is a salesperson. Elon Musk benefited 415 million from government handouts or grants, excuse me, during the Obama administration, and he's going to benefit from more handouts from Trump. And when Trump wins in November, because I do believe he's going to win, I don't think Kamala's going to win, but I'm going to be on how many government grants and tax breaks that Tesla, SpaceX get during his time in office. And if it's much higher than other companies in the same sector, I'll be very, very curious about that. And especially now with the ban on Chinese EVs or the tariffs placed on Chinese EVs, I would be so curious to know what um, this means for Elon Musk. And I say this with a smirk because, it was Joe Biden that introduced the ban or tariffs on Chinese EVs. I think Donald Trump's going to continue that. He's going to continue that, and he's going to pump money into Tesla and SpaceX because it's American-made jobs. But there's a policy that Trump and Biden would agree on. Biden also sent $20 billion to Israel. I'm sure Donald Trump would agree with that too. Donald Trump, during his entire time in office, only quote unquote sent $8 billion to Israel. And Biden is currently sending tens of billions, of course, after October 7th as well. But there's a lot of policies that the Democrats and Republicans agree on that we don't talk about, and I think that's very important. Nemnock says, Mein Kampf isn't banned in Canada. It's banned by some schools and libraries, but there aren't any government bans. No, Nemnock, I think you're wrong. I remember looking this up, and it's a clear ban. Let's see. Mein Kampf ban Canada. I remember this. I think there's like a government policy. Doot, 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 doot. Yes, here we go. Let's, where is it? Wow, there is like, oh wow. So it is a book. Hang on. I remember seeing this. Okay, give me a second here, folks. I remember seeing this. Okay, I remember seeing the government policy, but Wikipedia does have this as well. And let me just see. Banned books in Canada. Yeah, so there's a bunch of books. Yeah, so Lolita has been banned in Canada since 1956. But you can still import it from the US, which was lifted apparently in 1958. So I remember reading that Mein Kampf was as well, but I can't find that exact reference. Let me just see one last thing. Okay, folks, I'm gonna find that. I can't find it right now, but I remember reading that somewhere. So my own apologies, folks. I don't believe that's the case. So Namnock, thanks for that. I'm gonna look into it some more. I remember reading it somewhere, but maybe I'm totally wrong. And let me just read some of the last comments here. Yeah. So Jay Ramesh says, as far as support for Israel, it's mostly been bipartisan. It's the way it's been that way for most of the American history. That's true. And it has been bipartisan. But again, there's other policies I've mentioned on this live stream. Jay Ramesh, the Willow Project in Alaska, I think Trump would be in favor of as well. That was signed by Biden. So lots of policies there too. Yes, Nemnock says Lolita was banned, but it isn't any longer. Nemnock, according to this, Lolita is still banned, but you can import it from the US. But besides the point, I'll look into that as well. Nemnock, maybe I'll do an entire live stream about that. The book issue is a whole separate can of complicated worms. I agree. This is very complicated. I'm not sure exactly how I got here, but I think it was from the perspective, oh yes, of like, are you truly in favor of freedom? So yes, folks, I hope that this helps kind of demystify my thoughts on this. I think that again, we as conservatives, we have to be a bit more like vigilant of when we're being sold something, and we should demand more of our like leaders as well. And another thing we should also remind ourselves of is, and someone said this in the comments, they said, I would be skeptical of anyone with a lot of money and power when it comes to politics. Proceed with caution. And I could not agree more. It's like there's money, there's tax breaks, there's all types of things behind the scenes that are happening. And we should all be very skeptical about all these billionaires like selling us up the river on these things, because at the end of the day, their concerns versus the middle class or the working class concerns is ridiculous. And so like they're in it for tax breaks, they're in it for, their own power and influence. They have no conception of the day-to-day issues of the working class or the middle class, and how could they? They're more concerned about, I make so much money, I need as many tax shelters as I can, and where can I shelter my taxes the most? So, all that to say, let's be a little bit more reflective of the um, people we believe, because they may not be, who we think they are. And I think that's very important for us as conservatives as we move forward. But folks, I am going to end that there. I've been going on for a while. Penn State Chess Club, nice name, says, when did I finish my shift at Tim Hortons? Penn State Chess Club, I don't work at Tim Hortons. Although I know you probably think I do. Interesting that you ended up on the Open Minds live stream. Hopefully you stick around and maybe change your perspective on things and engage with people who are very thoughtful in their comments, like Jay Ramesh and others, and Zenu and others. But hopefully the community will weed you out so you can't keep with these ignorant comments anymore. But folks, that'll do it for me. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evenings. This has been another great live stream. Let me know what you think in the comments below, how I can get better. I know there's a lot of questions people still have. I'm doing my best to get through all of them. There's going to be more content, and I'm going to send out more podcasts. So don't fret. Things will get updated. This live stream will continue, and I'll be doing this on a nightly basis. Thanks again, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful night. Thanks for joining in, and I will catch you in the next one. Take care, everyone.